Welcome back, everyone. In this chapter, starting chapter 2 today, we talked at the end of chapter 1 about Spanish colonization of the New World, a little bit about French colonization of the New World, and I kept mentioning that we would spend chapter 2 talking specifically about the English. Now, just a little bit of clarification of some terminology before we go forward. Now, this might sound really basic and really obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't know this. Let me just clarify when we talk about European colonization. Europe is a continent, okay? Europe is a continent in which there are multiple countries. So if you just say European colonization or European settlement, European exploration, you could be talking about Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, any of those things, Dutch, anything from Europe. English colonization, I found people easily confuse this with European or just sometimes don't notice there's a difference. English colonization, we are talking about people from England. Sometimes, and although I realize this is far more technical than we're making it, there is a technical difference here, but sometimes we might say Britain as opposed to England or Great Britain. Great Britain is the larger empire, including England and a few other places, but I will use those words interchangeably, so just know that particularly right now, I will probably use the word English more, but as we go on, we probably will start using the word British more. But that, for our purposes, is going to mean the same thing in the same place, although, yes, there are some differences there. Just to know we're all on the same page, just realize that's the terminology that I'm going to use. Now, these colonies, and we talk about, in the title of this chapter, it says American colonies. We've been looking at America or the Americas. Chapter 1, that was referring to North America, Central America, and South America. When we talk about these American colonies, English colonies, we're talking about the ones that eventually become what you have probably referred to as the 13 colonies, English America, the British colonies, the 13 colonies that eventually declare their independence and win a war for independence from Britain becoming the United States. So we're looking at the foundations of all of that. So here we're going to look at things in much more detail and go through pretty much each of those 13 colonies, some of which we will talk about more than others. But we're going to start by talking about the initial interest by England in America, because they come a good bit later. So Spain had colonized in the New World in the 1500s, and at first England, was slow to get on the bandwagon about that because, they saw the New World as belonging to Spain. They did not have the initiative to do it. They didn't have the money to do it. Financial reasons are a big reason why countries may or may not choose to engage in colonization, if they've got the money or not. What becomes kind of the game changer for the English, it does have to do with rivalry, and that is somewhat religious. When Queen Elizabeth I becomes queen, now you probably spent a good deal of time in world history talking about Queen Elizabeth I and how powerful England became, that this was the beginning of a golden age for England. And, she's ambitious. She wants England to compete with Spain, which was their big rival. Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant and solidifies England as a Protestant nation, and therefore that intensifies their rivalry with Spain, which, as you hopefully remember, was incredibly Catholic. So wanting to compete with Spain, wanting English interests to be advanced, wanting England to be more powerful, that's going to include colonization. So she's going to see colonization and exploration and claiming lands in the New World as being essential to that. So you have sort of the national direction, you have the leadership that is willing to do what it takes in order to make colonization successful. So her becoming queen is a game changer for England, and that's when English colonization will start. Now, that still brings the issue of money. How are we going to finance it? England was not near as wealthy at this time as Spain was, and Spain's voyages, or rather their exploits at colonization, had largely been paid for by the government. Well, England did not have that kind of money. So the way that they finance a lot of their colonies, not all English colonies will be financed this way, but certainly some of the first ones, they are financed by what were called joint stock companies. Now, joint stock companies were companies where investors, people who did have money, would invest their money, pool their money together into this company, like, say, for example, the Virginia Company or the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, so forth. They pool their money into that company, and that money will then finance a colony in their case, North America. And then those stockholders, the people that put their money in, they stand to gain a profit. They will get a share of the profits that colony turns. Profit is has a lot to do with this. So it's very much the same way that someone today might invest their money in the stock market, or might invest in a new product, or might invest in a new business. They do that to provide financial backing to that business so it can do whatever it needs to do, and then that investor is going to get their investment back plus some. So these are financial risks, they're financial ventures. These were all, in some way, it comes back to profit. But what joint stock companies will do is provide the financing for these things in a time when the government maybe couldn't pay for it or didn't want to put up their money. The companies would. But it also means that these colonies stand to make a profit. That's their purpose, is to turn profit for their investors. It changes the way that those colonies are administered. Instead of them being governed directly by the crown, by the king or the queen or whoever's in charge, the way that they were in Spain, oftentimes they don't answer to the king, they answer to the investors. And that changes the way that those colonies are governed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we go along. So in the late 1500s, England attempts their first colony, which didn't go so well. So they kind of have all the things lined up, the money and the finances and all of that and the interest, but it doesn't take off as easily as they might have liked. So in the late 1500s, England, with the first round of investors led by an English nobleman named Sir Walter Raleigh, they go across the Atlantic to North America, because that had so far not been claimed by Spain, to establish their first colony, which they established a settlement there called Roanoke. Now, Virginia is the larger land that they're claiming. That's the bigger colony, and that's pretty much everything as far as the eye can see. They're claiming that as Virginia. Roanoke is their settlement. Roanoke would have been located in what's today North Carolina, one of the islands off the coast of what is today North Carolina, but at the time they would have called that Virginia. So Raleigh and a couple of hundred investors or settlers start this little settlement there at Roanoke. About a little while later, Sir Walter Raleigh and some of the other leaders of the colony go back to England, to sail back to England to try to recruit more settlers and get more supplies and those kind of things so they can come back and further grow the settlement. They end up gone for about 3 years. They were only supposed to be gone, as long as that took. But when they get back, England is in the middle of a war with Spain, and that prevented them leaving. So it was probably about 3 years before they were able to get back to Roanoke. And many of you have heard this story before and know that when they get back to Roanoke, they go to the island where Roanoke should be, and they find it's disappeared. They find nobody is there. There's no people. They find the houses are gone. They seem to, and it's not like they're there and just abandoned, like they've been dismantled. There's not really much of a sign. They can tell that there's signs that there was a settlement there, so they know they were in the right place, but they can't find any of the people. They don't see any of the things. It seems they left in a kind of an organized way, perhaps, but they don't know where they are. So this is why Roanoke is sometimes referred to as the lost colony, because it doesn't survive. It mysteriously disappears. And this is still one of those big, history's mysteries. We don't really know. We have theories, and some that are more backed by some more evidence than others, but we really don't know what happened to the colonists at Roanoke. There are, again, theories from crazy things like they got abducted by aliens and weird stuff like that. Most likely, the only thing that the Sir Walter Raleigh and those that were with him did find, and that's what's depicted in this painting right here, is the word Croatoan carved into a tree. Croatoan was the name of a Native American tribe that was not too far away. So the going theory, what probably is most likely, is that they may have been killed. They could have been attacked by the Croatoan, or most of them killed. Or it's also quite likely that many of the colonists died, starvation, disease, or Native American attack, and that the survivors, we don't know if that was 2 people or 25 people or what, may have gone to live with the Croatoans, may have gone to stay with them. Sir Walter Raleigh and his party never went to go look. They never went to where the Croatoans lived to see if there was anybody there. And by the time the English come back to try a second settlement, enough time had passed that, it's possible that maybe some of those colonists were still alive, but by that time they would have really been so absorbed into Native American culture, they would not have been recognized. So we really don't know. There's some evidence to suggest that some of them may have survived. A lot of scholars believe that at least a few of them did, but we really don't know. But nevertheless, we can certainly say that the first attempt at English colonization was a failure. Roanoke did not survive. So England, several more years passed. Queen Elizabeth I dies, and it is under her successor, James I, that England decides to try again. This time, it will not be led by by a single person, Sir Walter Raleigh, but by a joint stock company, in this case, the Virginia Company. So the Virginia Company wants to try again. Let's see if we can make this work a second time. So in 1607, investors from the Virginia Company go again across the Atlantic to a little bit of a different site, still in Virginia, but on what we call the Chesapeake Bay area. And they established Jamestown in 1607. Many of you have probably heard of Jamestown before. And Jamestown will have the distinction of eventually being the first permanent, or the first lasting, the first successful English settlement in America. So we know that it will eventually survive, but it doesn't go easy from the start. There are a lot of problems plaguing Jamestown and plaguing Virginia for the first couple of decades. It takes a while for these colonists and the Virginia Company to kind of get it together. And Jamestown starts out disastrously. It gets off to a terrible start. It is surprising in a way that they don't end up the same way that Roanoke did. And it kind of gives us some insight as to what probably went wrong at Roanoke as well. They were so unprepared. It's crazy when you think about how unprepared they were. Most of these investors in the Virginia Company, these are wealthy individuals that have never done a day's hard labor in their life. They brought, these people, you have to also remember this is really important. They're going after, or they're modeling all of this on the Spanish. They think they're going to do exactly what the Spanish did, which is come in and find rich and powerful Native American empires. There are myths that this land is just dripping with gold. It's everywhere. It just litters the shores. They're going to waltz right in there, get themselves some gold and some emeralds and some diamonds and whatever else, and go on back to England and be rich as everything. That's what they think is going to happen. So they brought their shovels and they brought their pans and all that stuff to dig for gold, but they didn't bring people that knew how to build houses. They didn't bring people that knew how to grow crops. Nor did they try to do any of that stuff when they got there. They get out their shovels and start doing all that stuff, start looking for their treasure, but they don't build any houses, and they don't gather any food, and they don't plant any crops, and they don't do anything, to protect themselves. They were not thinking about survival, and these were people that just didn't possess those skills. And when you told them, hey, you need to chop down these trees and build houses, they refused to do it because they were, noble, rich people that didn't do that kind of stuff. So they just get off to a terrible start. They don't find any gold, for one thing. They don't get any of that. The winter comes, and winters can be pretty harsh in Virginia, and they haven't built any houses, and they don't have any food. More than half of the colonists die in the first year. There are stories of people resorting to eating their shoes, eating the bark off of trees. There are even some stories of cannibalism taking place in the early years at Jamestown because things were so bad. Again, it's no wonder why the colonists at Roanoke disappeared if they have the same kind of mindset as the Jamestown colonists did. So things are going terribly for Jamestown and almost doesn't survive. An individual who is often credited with kind of helping Jamestown to survive those first couple of years is John Smith, who some of you probably know from the Pocahontas legend. John Smith was a real person, as was Pocahontas, although the whole love story between them is completely false. John Smith was one of the leaders at Jamestown, or he emerges as a leader at Jamestown by kind of forcing the colonists to get organized and forcing them to work. He sometimes gets a reputation for being kind of like a dictator and telling everybody what to do, and that's probably not wrong. He, kind of instituted a system of this is what work has to get done today. This is what you're going to do. And if you don't work, you don't eat. That became kind of his famous mantra. If you don't put in the work and you don't, do your share, then you will not eat. That we all have to do this together. So that's kind of how they pulled together in those first couple of years, forcing people to do the work necessary. And also, John Smith helps establish trading relationships with the Native Americans that were nearby, the Powhatan people that were nearby. And it is certainly not without Native American help, trading with them, usually weapons for food and for other supplies. the Jamestown settlers would certainly not have survived those first couple of years had it not been for Native American assistance. That's true of a lot of English settlement. Now, John Smith and the help of Native Americans kind of helps them get by those first couple of years, and they sort of limp along trying to figure out what to do. Ultimately, remember that this is a colony that is started by a joint stock company that at the end of the day has to turn a profit, and or the whole thing doesn't work. And they thought and they hoped and they believed that they were going to get profit off of gold and jewels and all these things. But what they come to find out rather quickly, and they're pretty darn sure of it after a few years, is that there's no gold in Virginia. There's no treasure in Virginia. There's not going to be any. And so if they're going to make this thing pay, if they're going to make this work financially, they're going to have to find something else that they can profit from off of in this colony. And what that happens to be, what ultimately does save Jamestown and saves Virginia and saves English colonization in the long run, is tobacco. Not gold, but tobacco. Tobacco, we talked about it a little while ago as an example of the Columbian Exchange. You know, this had been grown by Native Americans for centuries, but the English will come in and turn it into a major commercial crop. And this is when it explodes, and we get tobacco plantations sprouting up all over Virginia and then expanding into what will eventually be, you know, Maryland and the Carolinas and places like that. So really, it's tobacco that saves it and becomes profitable. And this is where some people will start to amass great amounts of wealth, is off of tobacco production. Now, to encourage that tobacco production, to encourage settlement, to encourage the cultivation of tobacco, and to kind of just put in this whole system, something was used in Virginia and in a couple of other of the southern colonies, a system called the headright system. And you'll notice I've just put up the whole definition here for you of the headright system because it's a little bit tedious, and it helps me explain it a little bit better if you're not having to listen to and hang on to every word. So the headright system, again, this was used in Virginia and several other colonies. A headright is a plot of land. It's a land grant, okay? And so what the Virginia Company and other colonies might do is they would say, okay, an investor, you invest X amount of money, you get a headright, which is basically a plot of land, which you can then turn into your tobacco plantation. You're going to grow your tobacco there, and you can build a fine house there and all those kind of things. But it also requires that person who's getting that headright, they've got to put labor on that land because, you know, to grow these crops, you got to have workers. And so it incentivizes them to put labor on that land. Now, you have a lot of people in England, you know, byproducts of that old feudal system, that are homeless. There's kind of an economic depression in England at this time, which means you have a lot of people that have no land. There's no way they can get land. They have no money. They have nowhere to go. They're just kind of around there. There's sort of this struggle of sort of this indigent population in England. Those are all people that might be willing to come to these colonies and work, you know, someone's land, but they have no way to get there. They're too poor. They have no way to pay for their passage. So that's where this headright system comes in. The investor, you're going to get land, but you pay for the passage of these workers, people that are going to come and work for you on that land. And that's how they're going to pay back their debt to you. So I put in my money to the Virginia Company. I get my headright. I'm also going to pay for, in addition to that, these 15 people that are going to come and work on my land for me and pay off that debt. And then after they pay off their debt, they're free to go. Those people are called indentured servants. You may have heard this concept of indentured servitude before. Indentured servants are the people working the land in these early days. These are the people out in the tobacco fields, all of that. They are working off that debt to that landowner. They are pretty much bound to that landowner. You may say kind of almost owned by them. It is the precursor. This is before slavery existed, because slavery, as I've kind of mentioned before, grows gradually. It does not immediately exist, and at this point does not exist in these colonies. At first, they were using indentured servants, which were for the most part white English people that are paying off this debt. Now, the way indentured servitude greatly differs from slavery in a couple of ways, but one of the big ways is it is supposed to be temporary. It's not forever. You know, they're working off a debt, and the idea here is, and the way this was pitched to people that would be indentured servants, because obviously if I'm going to go to a whole new world and nearly enslave myself to somebody for a certain amount of time, there's got to be something in it for me in the end, right? So indentured servitude, is supposed to be temporary. They would typically work about 5 to 7 years. And then the idea is then you're free. And not only could you be free, but now maybe you can get some land. You can be a farmer. You can have your own plantation. Maybe you'll even get to be a Virginia gentleman and all that sort of stuff. So that's the way this is kind of pitched to people, is that once you pay off your debt, you can be a landowner and you can be part of the ruling class, something that would have never happened had they stayed in England. Well, what the headright system does is it recruits both the landowners and it recruits the land laborers, and it incentivizes people to do both, to be a landowner and to come over as a laborer. And also the way this works is the more money you put in, the more headrights you get. The more people you bring over, the more land you get. So it, incentivizes people to do more and more. But it automatically ties land ownership and labor, or it ties putting labor on the land to everything. And it immediately creates this system of wealthy and powerful landowners and then land laborers who don't have any legal status at all, who are beholden to someone, almost like owned by someone. That starts almost immediately. So we'll look more later about indentured servants and how that system starts to fade out of style and slavery starts to become the preferred system. But at first it was indentured servants. Now, a few other interesting features of Virginia before we move on to some of the other Southern colonies. One of those was the Virginia House of Burgesses. Now, at first, when these colonies like Virginia are first started, it is pretty much under the total control of the Virginia Company. They run it out lock, stock, and barrel. They make the rules. As time goes on and the colony gets larger and there are more and more landowners there, eventually those landowners are going to start being dissatisfied with that system, and they will start to say, we're the landowners, we don't want to listen to what the company says, we want to have a say-so in this. So somewhere in the 20s or 30s, the Virginia company realizes they have to give up some of the control that they have had to the landowners, and that's why the Virginia House of Burgesses was created. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the elected assembly for Virginia. So it's an elected assembly, an elected legislature to represent those landowners, and a lot of those landowners would be elected to the House of Burgesses to make law for Virginia. So this is their representative assembly. It is their legislature. It's their lawmaking body. They're basically their Congress. In fact, Virginia still calls their state legislature, their state Congress, the House of Burgesses. It's still there. This is important because this is the first representative assembly in America. And other colonies, as they start to be established, will eventually follow suit with this. Perhaps not immediately, some of them immediately, but will eventually have elected assemblies like this. In other words, democracy. Okay, this is an element of democracy. Now, no, it is not near as democratic as we might want it to be. Parts of this are not very democratic by our standards because, as you can imagine, the only people that can vote are the rich landowners, all men. The only people that are being elected are the rich landowners, all men. So certainly it's not very inclusive, but it is still building this principle very, very early on in these colonies, and I can't stress this enough. Democracy does not happen in America overnight. The concept that people should have a say-so in their government does not happen overnight. Some of that was part of their English tradition, and some of that is being built in the colonies way before the American Revolution happens. This is 1620-something. The American Revolution doesn't happen until 1776. The idea of democracy, democratic foundations, examples of self-government, of the people in these colonies governing themselves, making their own laws, establishing these principles that power comes from people and not from kings and that kind of thing, doing things their own way, not listening to the king, that starts at the very beginning, and it starts right here. So even though there are plenty of things about Virginia that are so not democratic by our standards, it is still building that tradition. We're going to talk about that a lot, and I'm going to keep calling your attention to examples of democracy, examples of self-government, and things that are just building a political tradition in the colonies that eventually lead to that revolution. This is why in the 1760s and 1770s, the colonists are going to get so mad about stuff, is because they get really used to being able to govern themselves. And that starts very, very early on. So we will keep coming back to that. Now, when we look at these colonies, there are three major regions. So we're going to look at them not in chronological order of their founding, but by region. Virginia is the first one, and it is in the region that we call the South. Surprise, surprise. So we have southern colonies. There are 5 southern colonies. We're going to run through the rest of them. So Virginia is one. There are 4 others we're going to run through right here, and those are our southern colonies. Later, we will look at New England colonies and the middle colonies. So those are your 3 regions. Now, Virginia was the first one, established as an economic venture by the Virginia Company, eventually becomes tobacco producing. Now, the next one we're going to look at is Maryland, which in a way turns out to be very similar to Virginia in that it's going to be a tobacco producing colony, agricultural, head right system, indentured servants, and all of those things. But what does set Maryland apart is part of the reason for its original founding. Maryland was started by a guy called Lord Baltimore, or that was his title anyway, Lord Baltimore. And that's pretty easy to remember. Obviously, Baltimore, Maryland is named for him. And Lord Baltimore was an English Catholic. Now, we've said that England was a Protestant nation, and so that meant that life could be sometimes a little bit difficult for Catholics. They were not, by this point, just outright killing them, but they might be discriminated against. They might be looked over for certain things. They may find it difficult to practice their religion without persecution or discrimination. And so that is why Lord Baltimore starts Maryland. It was a refuge for Catholics. Yes, they want to make money, and yes, people like Lord Baltimore are going to grow tobacco and make money and all of that, but it was also meant to be a refuge for Catholics, for English Catholics, where the Catholic Church would be the official religion as opposed to the Church of England. Now, that will not be the case always. Eventually, Maryland will grant religious toleration to all Christians, at least. One of the first colonies to do that, but it has a religious purpose to its founding, whereas Virginia does not. But remember, economically, it is rather similar to Virginia with tobacco production and all of that. Now, our other southern colonies include the Carolinas. We're just going to kind of breeze through them. The Carolinas, North Carolina, and South Carolina actually started out originally as just one colony called Carolina. It's named after King Charles, who was I think Charles II, which was the king at the time. Carolina is actually a Latin version of the name Charles. And it was started by a group of proprietors called the Lord Proprietors. That's how we refer to just the group of them. A proprietor is an owner, okay? Like Lord Baltimore was for a long time the proprietor of Maryland. He owned it outright. So the Lord Proprietors in Carolina, there's a couple of owners, these Lord Proprietors. But eventually, or even not even eventually, but really from the beginning, the northern portion of Carolina, this part, developed very differently from the southern portion of Carolina, this part. So eventually, and I can't remember the year, you don't need to know it, it splits officially into North and South Carolina, respectively. So North Carolina, of course, this part, North Carolina more closely resembles Virginia. You can see that proximity-wise, it is right there underneath Virginia. So it, geographically and all of that, it resembles Virginia. So it is largely going to be a tobacco producing colony. It's not nearly as populated as the southern portion. Most of the settlement occurs in the southern portion. So North Carolina is far more sparsely populated at first. It's settled by a lot of people that are just kind of migrating out of Virginia or could not find land in Virginia, so they go to North Carolina, but mostly a tobacco producing colony. So tobacco production is happening in North Carolina, in Virginia, and also in Maryland up here. We call these the Chesapeake region colonies. Now, South Carolina kind of stands apart. South Carolina is rather unique as far as the southern colonies in a couple of different ways. First of all, South Carolina, the southern portion, tobacco doesn't grow incredibly well there. What does grow well in South Carolina was rice and indigo. So their two main crops end up being rice and indigo. Indigo is a plant that is used to make dye, like blue jeans are dyed with indigo. Rice, as you may know, it grows in like marshes under the water, and the lowlands, what they call the lowlands right there on the coastal areas of South Carolina, were very well suited for that. So rice becomes the main cash crop there. The other thing that makes South Carolina unique is in regard to slavery. I mentioned slavery a while back, saying that slavery doesn't immediately exist in Virginia. It takes it a while to develop. It is kind of a slow process. The exception to that is South Carolina. In South Carolina, slavery exists almost immediately, pretty much overnight. Slavery, as in African slavery that was permanent, hereditary, and all of that, what would eventually take hold everywhere, it happens in South Carolina almost immediately. They don't have this kind of transitional period that we will see in our other southern colonies. The reason for that is because most of the families and most of the people who are originally coming to settle in the southern portion in South Carolina were coming from, as this map I just noticed even says so, they were coming from the Caribbean. A lot of them, they were English families, but they were people that had originally settled in English colonies in the Caribbean, places like Barbados, places like Jamaica, where they grew sugar, and where they already practiced slavery, where slavery had been a part of their system for a long time. So when those people come and settle South Carolina to start a rice plantation or something, they bring slavery with them. So the system automatically just gets transplanted there. So South Carolina is the first to really have slavery. It is always going to be one of few southern states. While all southern states or southern colonies will have large African American populations, South Carolina is one of the few in which the African American population outnumbers everybody else. And I don't know if it's coincidence or not, maybe it is, but we're going to talk throughout the year about more than one instance in which South Carolina seems to be the first in line to do something drastic when it comes to defending slavery and wanting to keep slavery. Whether or not that has to do with the fact that they had it for so much longer, I don't know. But it is an interesting coincidence, if anything. So South Carolina is different in what they grow, but also in their early reliance on slave labor from the very beginning. The final of the southern colonies and the final of the 13 colonies period is Georgia, our neighbor, which just barely squeaks in there. Georgia is only started just a couple of decades prior to the American Revolution. The founder of Georgia is James Oglethorpe. This guy pictured right here. And Georgia, although it's going to be agricultural and they'll produce sugar and a few other crops there, it's kind of has an unusual origin as well. It was originally started by James Oglethorpe as a refuge for debtors. A refuge means like a safe place, a safe haven. Debtors are people who were in debt, people that owed money, people that had taken out loans and couldn't pay them back. And in these days, if you were a debtor, that was considered like criminal behavior. Most people in American society are debtors today. We owe money on something, whether we owe money on our house or our car or our credit card, but that just wasn't done back then. If you were a debtor, that was considered irresponsible. That was like stealing. You were considered a criminal. So you went to debtor's prison. If you couldn't pay off your debts, you went to prison. And so James Oglethorpe started Georgia as a place where debtors could go, where they could escape debtor's prison. They wouldn't have to go to prison, but also it's like a rehabilitation sort of a thing. I mean, this was considered at first, not for long, but at first like a prison colony. And this was a place where you'd be reformed because, again, they considered debtors as like irresponsible. There was something wrong with them. And they were like, criminal. And so they needed to be, in an environment where they wouldn't be tempted to do bad stuff. So originally in Georgia, and obviously none of this stuff lasts for long, they didn't allow alcohol. They didn't allow gambling. They didn't allow card playing. They were real strict with how people lived because they didn't want to, tempt them to, do something illegal, something bad. Obviously, none of that lasts too long because when other people start moving there, they will lift those rules. Even slavery wasn't allowed at first. Another reason for Georgia is it's what's called a buffer colony, a buffer like a shield or a protection, because this is it's in between your English colonies like Virginia and so forth and Spanish Florida. In fact, I can show you that this previous map we were looking at. See, here's Spanish Florida right there in the orange, and then you've got the Virginia and the Carolinas. This would be Georgia. So Georgia is the buffer. It's the shield. It's to make sure we have kind of a presence here, and we're establishing ourselves and we're claiming land here so that the Spaniards don't get it and that kind of a thing. And so those 5 are your southern colonies: Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The things they all have in common: agriculture. They're all agricultural. They all have some form of unpaid labor, whether that's indentured servitude or slavery. They all have, a rich and powerful land-owning class. and then people that work the land that don't have any legal status hardly at all. They vary a little bit as far as why they were started or who started them, religion, all those kind of things. But those are some of the common threads, agriculture and the like. Now, when we get to the New England colonies, we will see things will be a good bit different. That's what we'll look at next. And we will see then how religion was the main motivating factor, how that is what shaped the development of most of those colonies. So next time, we will talk about New England.